Britain under Brown, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In his first public remarks as British Prime Minister last June, Gordon Brown promised, quote, a new government with new priorities. He has raised eyebrows among the Labour Party leaders by inviting politicians from outside the party into the cabinet, and, more recently, inviting former PM Margaret Thatcher to tea at number 10. How has Mr. Brown's big tent government fared in its first months in office? And what changes in British policy at home and abroad might lie ahead? For analysis of Britain under Brown, we're pleased to be joined by Sir Roger Carrick, a retired member of the British Diplomatic Service, whose posts included Consul General in Chicago, Ambassador to the Republic of Indonesia, and High Commissioner to Australia. He currently serves as Chairman of Strategy International Limited. Sir Roger, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you, Rob.
So I'm wondering if you could, again, help us set a little bit of context for the transition from Tony Blair to Gordon Brown, and what were some of the big challenges that Brown faced as he came into office?
Some of them were unexpected, and he had done an awful lot of planning, but you can't plan for the unexpected. For example, there was a terrorist attempt in Glasgow airport, which was foiled, which was a great boost for Brown. He handled his press encounters in that context extremely quickly, efficiently, well, and got over it, and that was a great boost. So the Brown honeymoon had begun.
Well, it seemed like he didn't have a honeymoon. He got thrown into the fire there.
Oh no, he did so well that he came out of the fire as if he'd been wearing asbestos, and to the cheers of the crowds, because the attempt was foiled by a very good security operation. And this was the first event, the first big test, if you like, of him as Prime Minister. And nobody was hurt, the terrorists were caught, job done.
You know, the experience of in the U.S., I mean, the popular perception is as those kinds of moments really test the demeanor and the leadership and the public persona of a leader. And did he cement that reassuring kind of leadership?
Yes, he did. He grew in that, in the perception of people. People were a bit wary. There had been so much trouble in the working up towards the transition, in the long arguments about it and so on. And when it came efficiently, well. Both men behaved very well. The job was done, and he was off on a good honeymoon. It's called the Brown bounce in British politics. It may just be beginning to be over. Maybe it's reached the apogee, but it was a very good start.
And what else? So what were the other longer-term issues that were on his plate?
Well, there was an issue quite soon after that one that could have been very long-term and may yet prove to be so. And that was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, which is a very frightening thing in British agriculture, as it would be in anybody's agriculture, but on a tiny island where this thing can spread on the wind very quickly. It was really a very serious worry. He and his new Minister for Agriculture, in effect has a different name, Hilary Benn, gripped that and acted very quickly. And there had been an outbreak of foot and mouth a few years ago under the previous administration, and action had not been quick. And it drifted, and the virus drifted, the disease drifted, and things were dreadful in the agricultural community, and exports of meat were stopped and so on. This outbreak happened suddenly, unexpectedly, like they all do, but it was narrowed down and gripped very quickly. And it seemed to be contained. And they seem to have worked out where it was. Sadly for the government, it may have been in the workings of a government laboratory next door to a vaccine-producing plant, which is American-owned, so there was a nice twist to all of that. But then the day before they were about to allow exports again and open everything up, there was a further outbreak within 10 miles. So Brown went up and then down. And that remains a worry. It may still be contained, and these things are dreadfully difficult, dreadfully complex to nail down and take a long time. And the number of government vets from all around the country have suddenly descended on this one little area just outside London in Surrey is enormous, and there's a great deal of work going on. So it may help, but that could hurt.
And this has potentially catastrophic consequences for the English economy. It's very big, potentially.
It's very big potentially. And last time it was horrendous. The number of farmers who went to the wall and the number of cattle that had to be killed, and sheep and pigs, it was the cloven hoofed animals, was just extraordinary. So it could be very big. But on other long-term issues, there was a trade union congress which the new Prime Minister had to address. And Gordon Brown has been seen over the years as less far towards the centre-right than Tony Blair. And people, certainly in the trade union movement, thought, well, this is good, we're getting Brown back, it's a bit further to the left, this will be all right. He was very fierce and very straightforward and very disciplined in his address to the Trade Union Congress. He gave no quarter on their current big beef, which is that their pay rise, which is in line with inflation, is nonetheless staged so that it doesn't really meet up with inflation, and they're pretty upset about that. This practice of staging pay rises in the public sector is long hallowed. I suffered from it as a public servant for 40 years. It's not new, but they'd picked it as an issue, and Brown was very tough on them, and that relationship is very important and could be a long-term, certainly one to watch in the long term.
Well, it seems like there may have been several constituencies on different issues who were not getting their way under Tony Blair, who maybe expected they'd get a little more under Brown. So is that where the trade unionists fall?
Yes, that's where they fall, and it remains to be seen. And so far, they're quite cross. They haven't made the early advances they'd hoped for. So there may be problems, and there have already been a couple of strikes on the London Tube, the Underground Railway, which haven't gone down well anywhere, I think, except among the unionists who see career advantage in that.
Now, of course, the big issue on the minds of most of the viewers here, most Americans, will be the role of the United Kingdom in Iraq and Afghanistan. Certainly, the big issue that's always the top of the news here. How has Gordon Brown approached those issues?
With circumspection and a little distance from the issues of the day, but with very clear support for the line that says we remain there till the job be done. Remaining there includes moving the body of troops, quite a large body, 5,000 I think, from Basra Palace to Basra Airport. And that move has happened since Brown became Prime Minister. It was planned, I understand, though I'm not sure this is public knowledge, but I understand that it was planned to happen 5 months or so ago, but was delayed because of discussions with the United States, who didn't want it to happen so soon. But it did happen when it happened, and as General Petraeus said to the Congress the other day, it happened in an orderly fashion, and he implied it was the right thing to do. Brown presided over that, and it seems to have gone quite well. That doesn't mean a pullout. That means a stage in the process of handing over to the Iraqis in Basra. Now, Basra is a very different kettle of fish from Baghdad, and all the experts will explain the enormous differences, the differences, Sunni-Shia differences, the difference in history and culture and local government and so on. And I think it's not insignificant that when Britain went in with America to Iraq, we were given, as it were, Basra and the south to look after. There were some who said that's the easy option, and in some sense it was. But I thought it very interesting that the British soldiery went into Basra very early on with soft hats, literally, under soft hat policy. Now that may have quite a bit to do with our history of dealing with counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland, in Malaya, going back to when that sort of thing really began. And we learned the hard way that blitzes and raids are not the right way to do it.
Yes, elaborate a little more on the difference between, let's call it the sort of hard helmet policy, the soft hat policy, when you go into a post-combat operations situation like that.
The objective, as it was first defined in the Malayan context, was all about hearts and minds, and I think that's where the phrase came from. And the idea is to go in to join and talk to and be part of the people. Patrols literally don't wear hard hats. They aren't going in aggressively with guns all in front of them. They're patrolling, armed usually, but not everybody necessarily armed. And they get to talk to the people. For that you need in Iraq interpreters, and that's a whole different difficult subject. How do you deal with the interpreters later? But that is a very different military type of operation than clearing out areas and establishing positions of strength, which has been done in the surge and in Baghdad. So Basra may have been easier. Our policy and our practice was different. Basra is different. The South is a very different kettle of fish. And I think in a way that's an answer I would offer to John Kerry's question. Was it right for the Brits to move from the Basra Palace out to the airport? If it's right to do that, why isn't it right in the rest of the country? And I think I've already implied that the rest of the country is very different, or Basra is very different. And I also think I've implied that the British way of doing these things can, in some circumstances, be more effective. We tried it we tried it a lot, and it worked in Malaya. We tried it hard in Northern Ireland, and it worked a bit, and eventually it worked well.
So this had been. We've got about a minute or so left before our break, and we'll certainly talk about this after the break. But this shift was in the planning for many months. The fact that it happened under Gordon Brown's tenure, has that changed the public attitude toward Brown on Iraq as opposed to Tony Blair, who seemed to suffer a lot in public opinion polls because of the Iraq policy?
I think that's a good question. I think the answer is the jury's still out, despite that event. But he gained a few brownie points from it.
So to speak, right?
So to speak. He'd like brownie points, wouldn't he?
Well, Roger, I want to pick up on this issue when we come back from our break. For our viewers, we'll be back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Sir Roger Carrick about the situation in Britain under new Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And Roger, before we were talking about Iraq and started getting into sort of the public attitudes toward Iraq under Gordon Brown as opposed to under Tony Blair. I think some of the perception of the pullback from Basra City to Basra Airport has been perceived here as a weakening of the British commitment in Iraq. And is that the case, or is that anything different or new or under Brown?
It's not a weakening of the commitment, I'm sure of that. It's not particularly new under Brown because it was planned to happen 5 months ago but was delayed because of US arguments that it should be delayed. The US, as far as I can see it from way outside, seems content with that now. It is part, as I say, of the transition to Iraqi control. There are all sorts of problems with Iraqi control, political and practical, but so far it seems to be working. And I don't think that the British public perceive that as a particular Brown change, despite the fact that it happened under him and had been planned for an earlier time under Blair. It certainly isn't a weakening of the commitment. There is, of course, a great debate in Britain. There are those who think we should pull out anyway now. There are those, and I think they're in a rather strong majority who think we shouldn't pull out till the job is done.
And so there's sort of this mirroring somewhat the debate here
Yes,
in the States, and I suppose those who are hoping for an immediate pullout were not necessarily looking for Gordon Brown for a lift to their cause, or were they?
Well, a few might have been, because he has been very quiet, supportive but quiet during the period of Blair's prime ministry over the Iraq events. So he was quiet, and some people might have looked for a change. But I don't think they're going to get it, and I think they're coming to realize that.
There has been some press note made of the appointment of David Miliband as Foreign Secretary, who had been seen as someone who'd been critical of the Bush policy in the Middle East. But he's also kind of come out pretty much reaffirming his commitment to see the job through.
Including in the Washington Times, I note. He wrote an article. Yes, he has indeed, and I'm not sure how accurate the previous perception was. He's a bright spark, David Miliband. He's young. He's the youngest Foreign Secretary we've had since David Owen, I guess, many years ago. He's very bright. He's very forward in everything he tries to do by way of explanation and so on. He seems to me to be entirely believable and straight, and I don't think there's any change in the policy as a result.
And now I want to switch, if we can, for a bit on to Afghanistan, where the role of the UK role, I think, has been relatively much more prominent, and they're seen as taking a real leadership role in Afghanistan. How has Prime Minister Brown's policy toward Afghanistan been?
Well, he's contending at the moment, I think, with some military advice that we need more people in Afghanistan and less in Iraq, and that may happen over time when it's right. He's contending with what the military call overstretch, and he's contending with all those dreadful problems in Afghanistan, including some Anglo-American disagreements over what we should do about the poppies. But he's been to Afghanistan, he's been to Iraq a number of times when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He knows exactly where he stands on that, and he will continue this policy of that we have the difficult sector in Afghanistan as opposed to the relatively easy one in Iraq. And I think there's no doubt the policy continues, trying to deal with the Taliban. There will be an element of hearts and minds, because that's the way we do these things, and it will be a bit differently. But it is tough in Helmand, and he's in the hanging tough for the long haul, I believe.
I know as a criticism of Tony Blair, his relationship with President Bush has drawn criticism, and Gordon Brown certainly had to strike his own tone in that relationship. How has he done that?
By the way he dressed, you would expect me to say, or at least some people will. And sure, that was different. He doesn't have any problem with the way he dresses. He just dresses the way he dresses, whatever's happening. It doesn't bother him. He is a man who loves America. I think this is not widely enough known, even in Britain. He admires America. He spent some time here. He always enjoyed, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the IMF meetings in Washington. He loved the atmosphere and so on. He doesn't wear that on his sleeve. He really doesn't. And he's a little more of a cautious, reticent man, perhaps, than his predecessor appeared. So those will inform his discussions with Bush. I don't see him strolling up to the president in the middle of an international conference when the microphone is left on and leaning towards the President Bush in slightly supplicant fashion and being told, "Yo, Brown." I just don't think that sort of thing is going to happen. It'll be a different relationship. Of course, people are different, but it'll be a very straight relationship where Gordon Brown's concerned, and no doubt George Bush. He will be absolutely straight, and that will be. Well, I don't say Blair was crooked in any sense at all, but he was a more charming, emollient chap. Brown perhaps has less charm, but more effectiveness, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting to study.
I remember hearing, this is years ago, remarks from some British diplomats about that there was no space between Tony Brown and George Bush, and that 10 Downing Street tend to follow that policy and override the Foreign Office. Is Gordon Brown, is he under pressure to to provide some of that distance, even if it's for optics?
Yes, I think he is under some pressure, and I don't think he'll take a lot of notice of it.
Interesting. He's the kind of person who will do what he needs to do regardless of the...
That's my sense of him. I mean, I've met him, I've worked with him a little bit when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer a long time ago. So my knowledge is very limited, but that's my impression.
I wonder if we can turn now, looking somewhat back to internal politics in the UK, and we mentioned at the opening this idea of the big tent and bringing in members of the opposition into the cabinet, and including having Margaret Thatcher over for tea.
Nice
so how is this being perceived, and how effective is this move to create this new atmosphere?
I think it's too early to tell how effective it is. It's being perceived with considerable interest, depending where on the political spectrum you sit and whether you think you might be in for an offer. He's tried, it appears, just reading the press, to recruit a senior Liberal Party man and been turned down. He has recruited into his government a former First Sea Lord, who's the head of the Royal Navy, a man who ought to have had no politics at all because he was running the Navy. And that's quite something. And he's recruited Admiral Alan West and put him in the House of Lords to do it. That's the device. See, the House of Lords does have some very good uses, and that's one. Alan West is now a Minister of State for Security. And that's, I think, a very good move. Because he's an expert in a lot of the security stuff. That one will, I think, prove effective. He's also put into the House of Lords a Brit from the United Nations, Malloch Brown, and he's a number 2 minister in the Foreign Office. Again, I really think it's a bit too early to see what that'll do, but he hasn't done a great deal of it. He's done a little, and he's appointed a Tory MP to run a review of a policy area. Having Margaret Thatcher into number 10, I thought was quite a delightful touch. She isn't terribly well these days. She's had many strokes, but she looked jolly good on that occasion, no doubt with the adrenaline coming back as she drove down Downing Street. Tony Blair consulted Margaret Thatcher, I believe, not in the same way, perhaps not so publicly, but I think Margaret Thatcher was, Lady Thatcher now, was delighted to be back in number 10, and he would indeed have asked her some sharp questions. I thought it was just a very nice thing to do at one level, a smart indication that he meant it, because his version of Big Tent is a government of all the talents. And he might have got something out of it. We're in substance. He certainly did in terms of the perception.
Does it have the same? I mean, in here, I mean, the Big Tent would mean basically liberals, Democrats, and Republicans coming together in a somewhat of almost a crass political sense. Is there that sentiment in the British public of wanting to see the various political poles coming together in a
I don't think so in the way you put it. I think it was a surprise to most of the British public. But there is, in the British public, as I see it, a considerable scepticism about politicians, which has been around for many years, but it's had a recent bit of a surge. It goes up and down, but that is there. I don't think one should exaggerate this Big Tent, because he's had a refusal, and there may not be all that much more of it, but it's a good idea. It's a new idea. It's a good thing to start with as a new Prime Minister. We
have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm wondering if I could ask you to take out your crystal ball and look into the future a bit for Prime Minister Brown, and what do you see as some of the significant issues coming up?
In terms of British politics, the one I mentioned earlier, the trade union, relations with the trade union will be an ongoing problem. The management of the economy, even though he's Prime Minister, not Chancellor, will forever be a problem. The issues like the effect in the UK of the subprime crisis, lending crisis, which, because banks lend against each other, has had an effect throughout Europe. And if Gordon Brown has some luck, he'll manage that to have a salutary effect on the long-term willingness to lend and willingness to borrow, which has been excessive. He'll watch all that sort of thing very carefully. He will be very, very keen to keep inflation down. There's a lot of Greenspan in him, and there's a lot of admiration in Brown for Greenspan. Those financial issues will still be important to him. There will be political issues about devolution. He's a Scottish Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. That in itself shouldn't be a problem, and on many occasions earlier hasn't been a problem. But because Scotland now has a Scottish nationalist administration whose real aim is independence for Scotland, there will be considerable issues and arguments, and relations between the two will be very interesting, I think.
I'm sure there are more issues on your list, but we've run out of time. Sir Roger Carrick, thank you very much. And to our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.